In the bustling, sun-baked streets of Miletus, where merchants argued over grain prices and sailors cursed the shifting winds, there lived a man who tried to think past the edge of the visible world. To most people in that Ionian city, the horizon at sea was a simple line. Beyond it lay other ports, other gods, other dangers. For Anaximander of Miletus, that hazy band between water and sky was something more. It was an invitation to imagine a structure larger than anything the senses could directly show. Where others saw the earth as resting on something, water, pillars, the back of some creature, Anaximander dared to ask, what if it rests on nothing at all? He lived in the 6th century BCE, a younger contemporary and likely associate of Thales, who is often called the first philosopher. If Thales was the one who said, all is water, Anaximander was the one who answered, no, not water, but something more abstract, something that cannot itself be any familiar element. In a culture just beginning to peel myth away some explanation, that move is astonishing. It means that less than a century after Greeks first began to search for a single underlying principle of the world, someone was already questioning whether any concrete, visible substance could serve in that role. Anaximander steps beyond water, air, earth, and fire, and names the first principle the apeiron, the indefinite, the boundless, that which has no fixed quality, shape, or limit. We know very little about his life. Later testimonies say he was the son of Praxiades, that he lived in Miletus, and that he may have been a citizen involved in public affairs. He is credited with drawing one of the earliest Greek maps of the inhabited world, with constructing a gnomon, a vertical staff for tracking the sun's shadow, and with proposing bold ideas about the earth, the heavens, and the origin of living beings. Almost none of his own writing survives. What we have are fragments quoted by later writers and a cluster of reports about his doctrines. Yet in these few surviving lines a new kind of thought is visible, speculative, systematic, and almost eerily modern in its ambition. Imagine Anaximander watching the sun trace its arc over Miletus, noticing how shadows shorten and lengthen, how different constellations rise at different seasons. He knows the earlier suggestion that water might be the primary stuff of all things, and he can see why it would be attractive. Water is everywhere and assumes many forms, but he is not convinced. Water is wet and heavy, he might say. If the ultimate principle were water, how could fire arise from it? If the world began in a single element with a fixed qualitative nature, how could its opposite ever emerge? To generate the range of qualities we see, hot and cold, dry and wet, light and dark, the origin cannot itself be any one of them. It must be something neutral, something without specific properties, something capable of giving rise to all contraries without being identical to any of them. The apeiron is his answer to that demand. It is indefinite in quantity and quality, boundless in extent, and inexhaustible as a source. It is not water, not air, not earth, not fire, but the hidden background from which such familiar stuffs arise by separation. In Anaximander's vision, the world begins when opposites differentiate themselves out of this undifferentiated background, hot from cold, dry from wet, and in the ongoing processes of nature, these opposites encroach upon one another in turn. Heat dries moisture, cold condenses vapor, dryness burns, moisture quenches. The cosmos is not a fixed arrangement, but a dynamic system of tensions and exchanges. Beneath that dance of contraries is the apeiron, endless and indestructible. One of the most striking features of Anaximander's thought is that he treats these processes in a quasi-legal language, in the only sentence of his book that comes down to us in something like his own words. He says that the things that exist give justice and reparation to one another for their injustice according to the ordering of time. To later ears this sounds obscure, even mystical, but consider what he might have been trying to say. When one quality dominates beyond its proper measure, say heat spreads too far or cold seizes too much, it commits a kind of injustice against its opposite. Over time, the system restores balance, the seasons cycle. A day gives way to night, drought is broken by rain, Anaximander uses ethical language to describe what we might call conservation and equilibrium. Nature, in his view, is not subject to the whim of capricious gods, but to an order that corrects excess. It is as if the cosmos itself enforces moderation. This way of speaking signals a profound shift. Earlier poets had described events like droughts or storms as punishments from gods, angered by human wrongdoing. Anaximander still uses the vocabulary of justice and recompense, but he relocates it inside the processes of nature themselves. The injustice is not moral but physical, the overreach of one quality, and the judge is not Zeus on Olympus but time. In subtle fashion, he begins to detach the language of law from mythic stories and attach it to impersonal patterns. It is one step on the way to the idea of natural law. His ideas about the structure of the cosmos are equally bold. Many ancient peoples pictured the earth as a kind of flat disk resting on something, on water, on pillars, on the back of a giant animal. Thales, with his emphasis on water, seems to have suggested that the earth floats on a vast watery expanse, like a log or a raft. Anaximander rejects this. If the earth rests on water, what does the water rest on? If each thing must be supported by another, we either fall into an infinite regress or arrive at something that supports itself. Instead of positing an unseen foundation, he imagines the earth as a free-floating body suspended in space, held in place not by a physical support, but by equilibrium. In his picture, the earth is a cylinder, like a column cut through its height, with humans living on one of the flat circular faces. This cylinder does not fall because there is no privileged down. In the middle of the universe, it is equally distant from everything in all directions. Just as an object placed at the exact center of a balanced scale has no reason to tip in one direction rather than another, the Earth has no reason to move. It remains where it is because of symmetry. This is a conceptual leap of breathtaking audacity. The familiar experience of objects falling toward the ground is no longer explained by saying that the Earth is supported by something else. Instead, the entire universe is reimagined so that stability arises from the absence of any reason to move, rather than from a visible prop. Around this cylindrical Earth, Anaximander arranges the heavenly bodies as concentric circles or wheels of fire, each encased in a ring of mist or air, with openings that we see as the sun, the moon, and the stars. When the fiery wheel of the sun shows through its aperture, day begins. When the opening turns away or is blocked, night falls. Eclipses occur when the aperture becomes clogged or partially closed. This model turns the sky into a kind of mechanism. The sun is no longer a chariot driven by a god across a dome, but part of a structured system that can, in principle, be described without recourse to divine personalities. Such images might seem fanciful from a modern astronomical perspective, but their importance lies not in their accuracy, but in their spirit. Anaximander is trying to build a coherent physical model of the cosmos that explains observable phenomena, day and night, changing seasons, eclipses, in terms of shapes, distances, and rotations, rather than stories about divine moods. It is one of the earliest efforts to imagine the universe as a geometrically ordered whole. His speculations do not stop at the heavens. He also offers one of the first naturalistic accounts of the origin of life and of human beings. The world, he suggests, began in a damp, warm condition. From this moist element, under the influence of the sun's heat, living creatures arose. The earliest animals emerged in water, enclosed in thorny or scaly coverings, almost like fish. Over time, some of these creatures ventured onto land. Humans, he reasons, could not have appeared in their current form from the beginning, because the human infant is too helpless to survive on its own. If human beings had always been as they are now, with infants requiring long parental care, they would have perished quickly. Therefore, he concludes, humans must have developed from other animals, likely fish-like beings that matured differently and could protect their offspring until they were strong enough to fend for themselves. Only later did humans as we know them separate out. This line of thought is astonishingly close, in its basic logic, to much later evolutionary arguments. Anaximander does not have the concept of natural selection or a detailed account of heredity, but he intuits that present life forms might have emerged from earlier ones, and that one can reason about this by considering functional constraints. Human babies are fragile. Fragile beings require care. Therefore, the conditions in which humans first appeared must have allowed for such care, which suggests a different originating form. It is a breathtaking example of how far sheer reflection on observed facts can go without any microscopes, fossils, or genetic theory. Running through all these doctrines, the apeiron, the free-floating earth, the fiery wheels, the watery origin of animals, is a single impulse: to treat the cosmos as a self-organizing system governed by internal relations, not as a stage upon which gods perform arbitrary acts. Anaximander's universe has a history. It begins in an undifferentiated state, undergoes separations and condensations, gives rise to worlds, and eventually lets them dissolve back into the indefinite. He is sometimes reported as saying that worlds are born and perish in cycles, like living beings. The apeiron is not a static backdrop, but a generative reservoir from which multiple cosmoses can arise over time. The ethical language of justice and injustice that he uses to describe natural processes hints at another layer in his thinking. When a hot, dry season lasts too long, it is as if the hot and dry principles have usurped more than their fair share. When a long winter finally thaws, when rain relieves a drought, the balance is restored. The injured qualities have received compensation. It is tempting to read this as mere metaphor, but for Anaximander, the analogy may be deep. Human beings know justice as a way of regulating conflicts, so that no one party permanently dominates and destroys the community. Nature, in his view, seems to regulate its own internal conflicts in a similar fashion across time. In place of a cosmic drama of feuding gods, he offers a drama of elements held to an order that transcends any one episode. We might imagine him walking through the agora of Miletus after a harsh summer finally breaks in a cooling rain. The cracked earth is darkened, dust is tamped down, and people step outside gratefully. To the average citizen, the explanation is straightforward. The gods have at last relented. To Anaximander, trained by long observation and reflection, the event speaks a different language. The excess of heat, having overstepped, is now checked. The wet and cold make their rightful return, not because they were petitioned by sacrifice, but because the system as a whole will not permit prolonged imbalance. Time itself, in its steady unfolding, enforces the settlement. The rain is not mercy, it is restitution. His concept of the apeiron also stakes out a position against the comfortable familiarity of earlier cosmologies. Water, air, earth, and fire are things human beings encounter constantly. To name one of them as the arche is to make the ultimate principle almost homely. The apeiron, by contrast, is something we never encounter directly. It cannot be pointed to or pictured. It is known only by reasoning that no determinate element could play the role of universal origin. In this sense, Anaximander is the first Greek thinker to insist that the deepest reality may be in some way beyond representation, grasped only through abstraction. Later metaphysics, from Plato's forms to the uncaused cause of Aristotle to the infinite of later theologians, will walk through the door he opens. At the same time, Anaximander does not retreat into pure otherworldliness. The apeiron manifests itself precisely through the changing, perishable things we see around us. Each thing that arises is a temporary configuration of opposites carved out of the indefinite and destined to return to it. The world in this picture is both rooted in something beyond all particular forms and always in motion within itself. There is no timeless, unchanging realm of perfection above or outside the cosmos. There is only the ceaseless rhythm of emergence and dissolution. If there is any divinity here, it is in the enduring, inexhaustible power of the apeiron to generate and reclaim worlds. Anaximander's astronomical and geographical speculations fit naturally into this outlook. To draw a map of the inhabited world is to suggest that scattered lands and seas form an intelligible pattern, one that can be surveyed from an imagined vantage point above human travel. To propose that heavenly bodies are arranged in an ordered system around the Earth is to imagine how the cosmos looks from a standpoint beyond any single observer's field of view. In both cases, he is practicing a kind of mental ascent, standing, as it were, outside the human scene and asking how things must be arranged in order to appear as they do to us. It is the same kind of reasoning he applies when he says that the Earth, being equidistant from all extremes, has no reason to fall in any direction. He is constantly asking, what configuration of unseen things would make the visible phenomena make sense? There is a certain loneliness in that posture. Most people are content to inhabit the world as it appears from their own limited perspective. Anaximander, like other early philosophers, steps back and suspects that the surface picture of a flat earth, of gods sending storms, of animals appearing as they are now from the beginning, is incomplete. To revise these pictures is to distance oneself, at least in imagination, from the shared narratives of the community. No wonder the early Milesian thinkers are remembered as slightly strange figures, respected, perhaps for their cleverness, but also regarded with some suspicion. They are the ones who ask questions that disturb settled certainties. The stories that later generations tell about Anaximander tend to emphasize his technical accomplishments, the gnomon, the map, the celestial model. Yet behind these devices is a temperament, patient, speculative, willing to question familiar explanations and to follow an argument wherever it leads. A vertical staff casting a shadow becomes, in his hands, a tool for reading the sky. A simple outline of coastlines and rivers becomes a daring claim that the world can be surveyed and ordered. A few observations about animals and infants become the basis of a proto-evolutionary hypothesis. In each case, he takes ordinary facts and rearranges them into a larger pattern. For someone listening today, centuries removed from Anaximander's world, his ideas can feel at once archaic and strangely recognizable. We no longer believe in fiery wheels or cylindrical earths, but we live in a universe we also imagine as vast, largely invisible, and structured by principles we infer rather than see. Modern cosmology, with its talk of dark matter, quantum fields, and inflationary epochs, is full of its own versions of the apeiron, entities posited because the observable phenomena seem to require them, even though we never encounter them directly. Our explanations, like his, go beyond what the senses deliver. At the same time, our relationship to the natural world still bears traces of the attitude he helped inaugurate. When we speak of climate systems seeking a new equilibrium after human disturbance, we are not so far from Anaximander's idea that the elements exact justice from each other over time. We no longer imagine hot and cold suing each other in a divine court, but we do think in terms of feedback loops and balancing forces. The language has changed. The underlying intuition that nature has its own ways of restoring balance is one he articulated early. In ethical and political life, too, his way of thinking has descendants. To see human laws as attempts to balance conflicting interests, to prevent any one group from permanent domination, is to mirror his sense of the cosmos as a field of contending forces held in check by a higher order. The distinction between natural justice and human justice, so important to later Greek thought, emerges from this comparison. If nature has a kind of justice, if heat and cold, wet and dry, light and dark are constrained by a shared order, then human beings can ask whether their own laws conform to or violate that deeper pattern. Philosophical reflection on justice begins, in part, with this analogical move. Of Anaximander's personal life, we know very little. He does not appear in anecdotes about falling into wells while gazing at the stars, nor is he associated with tales of sudden wealth like Thales and the olive presses. He is, in the historical record, more a set of doctrines than a character. Yet we can imagine him as a citizen of Miletus, involved in its civic debates, perhaps advising on calendars or festivals based on his astronomical observations. perhaps weighing in on practical questions with the same habit of abstraction that marks his cosmology. The boundary between philosopher, scientist, and public intellectual does not exist yet. He moves among these roles without naming them. When later philosophers look back at the pre-Socratics, Anaximander occupies a distinctive place. Thales is remembered as the one who began by choosing a concrete element as arche. Heraclitus will later be remembered as the dark, paradoxical thinker of flux and fire, Parmenides as the severe denier of change. Anaximander stands between these figures as the one who first pried the concept of the origin loose from any particular familiar stuff and imagined it as something qualitatively indefinite. That act of abstraction may be his most enduring legacy. It is the gesture that allows philosophy to move from physical speculation to metaphysics. We can also see his importance by watching how later thinkers respond to him. Anaximenes, who comes after him in the Milesian line, seems almost to retreat from the abstraction of the apeiron back to the more concrete choice of air as arche. Perhaps for many minds of the time, Anaximander's move felt too thin, too far from experience. Air, at least, can be felt as breath and wind. But even in this apparent step back, Anaximander's influence is present. Anaximenes explains how air, by rarefaction and condensation, becomes fire, wind, clouds, water, earth, and stone. Behind that story is Anaximander's insistence that the first principle must be able to generate contraries. Heraclitus, in turn, will radicalize the theme of tension and balance in his doctrine that war is the father of all and that the hidden harmony of the world is more powerful than the visible one. Parmenides will challenge the whole project of explaining coming to be by appealing to underlying principles, arguing that what truly is cannot come into being or pass away at all. In each of these cases, Anaximander is part of the conversation they are having, whether explicitly or not. Even Plato and Aristotle, centuries later, still contend with problems Anaximander helped formulate. When Aristotle classifies earlier thinkers in terms of the material principles they posited, he singles out Anaximander as the one who spoke of an indefinite nature rather than a determinate element. When Plato imagines a realm of forms beyond the visible world, grasped only by the intellect, he is moving along the path opened by those like Anaximander, who argued that the deepest truths about reality cannot simply be read off from the senses. The apeiron is not a form, and Anaximander is not yet a metaphysician in the later, technical sense, but his thought is one of the first attempts to reach beyond the interplay of familiar stuffs toward an originating reality that must be described in more abstract terms. There is also something instructive in the way Anaximander seems to move between concrete instruments and sweeping speculation. The same person who plants a gnomon in the public square to mark solstices and equinoxes is the one who declares that the earth hangs free in the middle of space. The tool and the theory belong together. By watching the shadow's length change over the course of the year, he could correlate celestial events with earthly cycles. Planting seasons, rising and falling rivers, the lengthening and shortening of days. That accumulation of regularities invites a further question. If so many rhythms can be tracked and anticipated, might there not be an even deeper regularity governing the whole show? The apeiron, in this light, is not an arbitrary invention, but the distant echo of many small observations woven into a single audacious hypothesis. We can imagine how disorienting his ideas must have been to his contemporaries. If the earth is unsupported, what holds it up? Nothing, he would answer, because there is nowhere for it to fall. If humans came from other animals, what happens to the stories of gods molding men from clay or planting them whole upon the earth? If living beings arise from moist conditions under the sun, what becomes of genealogies that trace noble families back to heroic ancestors favored by deities? Anaximander does not need to deny outright that gods exist. It is enough that he offers alternative accounts in which divine intervention becomes unnecessary. In doing so, he shifts the burden of proof. Those who wish to retain the old myths must now explain why we should invoke them in addition to, or instead of, the clearer and more economical explanations drawn from nature itself. For a culture still rooted in epic poetry, that shift is enormous. The songs of Homer and Hesiod weave the world into a story where every thunderbolt has an author, and every misfortune a divine backstory. Anaximander's cosmos has drama, but it is the drama of elements and opposites, not of jealous gods. Hot and cold, wet and dry, light and darkness contend and compensate without needing motives or personalities. To a modern ear, steeped in scientific thinking, this may sound familiar, even obvious. To a 6th century Greek audience, it would have felt almost alien. Yet it is precisely this strangeness that marks the birth of a new way of seeing, a willingness to let the world be governed by principles that do not flatter human expectations or fit neatly into inherited tales. There is, finally, a humility hidden inside Anaximander's grandeur. By positing the apeiron as the origin of all things, he implicitly confesses that what is most basic about reality is not something we can picture clearly. His first principle is not a god in human form, not a beast, not a mountain, not even an element like water or air. It is a word that names a kind of ignorance as much as a knowledge, the indefinite. We know that the origin cannot be any determinate thing, he seems to say. Beyond that, we must be content with a concept that signals its own failure to capture its object completely. This combination of boldness and restraint, the courage to posit an unseen source, and the honesty to admit that it exceeds our grasp, gives his thought a strangely contemporary flavor. It reminds us that serious thinking about the world often begins not with clarity, but with a refined sense of how little we can legitimately claim to know. Picture him one last time, standing on a rooftop in Miletus at dusk. The day's heat is fading, and the sky is a gradient from deep blue overhead to amber near the horizon. Stars begin to appear, one by one, in patterns he knows well. Somewhere below, in the streets, people argue, bargain, sing, and pray to the gods of their ancestors. Above him he sees not a vaulted ceiling, but a vast encircling order, wheels of fire, invisible structures, an equilibrium that holds the earth at rest. Beneath his feet, in his thoughts, the world is not a flat disk on somebody's back, but a body poised in the center of a boundless surrounding. And behind all this, he intuits, there is something that is not any of these particular forms, something that gives rise to them and receives them back, something inexhaustible, indefinite, boundless. He calls it the apeiron. We might call it, more loosely, the idea that reality exceeds any picture we can make of it, even as it remains the source of every picture. For the listener just beginning to explore philosophy, Anaximander offers a powerful double image. On the one hand, he is a man of his time, fascinated by the sun, sketching rough maps, picturing fiery wheels and cylindrical earths. On the other hand, he reaches far beyond his time, proposing that the ultimate origin of things is something we can never see directly, and that the universe is governed by patterns of balance and compensation rather than by divine whim. In his willingness to trust abstraction and to imagine structures that no eye can behold, he anticipates the later adventures of philosophy and science. His world is not yet our world, but it is one of the first attempts to think a cosmos that is, in principle, intelligible.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the sea, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be. 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 Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be. 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 Nowhere else to be.